Life in the modern world is not easy. The rate of inflation is increasing every year in the world with the rate of poverty, and life is more harsher for the people living in poverty that are deprived even from their basic needs. Now, just like you, it got me thinking, like, what could be more worse than this life? But if you think this is worse, then wait until you hear the life of peasants that lived during the Middle Ages. We will know in this video about how did they live, like, how many facilities of life did they had, what was their diet, and was it really any worse for them than in today's modern world problems? To find this out, let's travel back in time to the Middle Ages. Daily life. So what does a day in the life of a medieval peasant look like? Well, for the most part, peasants lived in villages that had been built upon land owned by a lord. Inside these villages, there were a selection of houses, barns and sheds, all surrounded by the cluster of animals. There were various peasant levels within the feudal structure upon which medieval civilization was based. For example, there were villeins, who were peasants who had formerly swore an oath of obedience to their local lord based on the Bible. This implied that they needed to get their lord's permission before they could get married. I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone pick this lifestyle? There were advantages to being a villein peasant, after all. For example, villeins were permitted to cultivate the land that belonged to their local lord. They were required to offer the lord an annual piece of their harvest in exchange for this, though. This was an incredibly difficult way of life, and many villein peasants ended up dying from starvation. Medieval villages were extremely dirty, unhygienic places, which led to a whole host of health issues. The unsanitary conditions were the result of a number of factors. For example, animals walked freely around the streets of these villages, and there was no effective method of waste disposal, meaning that both human waste and waste meat were often thrown into the streets. As a result of this, these villages were plagued with disease. Personal hygiene was likewise quite poor among medieval peasants. In fact, it is thought that peasants washed only twice in their whole lives, once when they were born, and again after they died. Work. Unlike today's world, where people have a large range of jobs, in medieval times, the majority of working class people were farmers. So what did the medieval peasants used to do? Life in medieval times revolved around the agricultural calendar, which is based on the sun. This meant that, during the summer, a medieval peasant's day may begin as early as 3 a.m. and last until sunset. Peasants often worked a small amount of land given to their family. On this field, they would plant a variety of crops such as barley, oats, and peas. Peasants would also collaborate with other families in their neighborhood to complete larger tasks like haying and plowing. Peasants were required to handle all general upkeep tasks in their communities, in addition to their work in the fields. This included constructing roads, clearing a forest, and performing any other tasks the Lord would give them. Days off were rare for medieval peasants, but they did exist. Church feasts marked sowing and reaping days, during which both peasants and lords may rest. As if all of this labor wasn't enough, peasants were also compelled to work for free on church property. Because society at the time was deeply devout and centered on the church, no one dared to ignore the work done on church grounds. The majority of peasants were farmers, but there were several exceptions. Some peasants worked as craftspeople, earning a living as carpenters, tailors, and blacksmiths. The house. So, we now know that peasants lived in villages, but what were their houses like? Well, you will not be surprised to learn that they were actually pretty basic structures. Peasants lived in cruck homes. These dwellings were made of a timber frame that was subsequently covered with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The straw was there to provide insulation for the house, and the manure, while unpleasant, was useful for binding the wattle and daub mixture together. Cruck dwellings were typically modest, with thatched roofs and relatively little furnishings within. The flooring of cruck dwellings were also coated with straw. Temperature regulation was not common in cruck houses, therefore they were often extremely hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. Furthermore, glass was highly expensive in medieval times. Thus, Kruk buildings had just holes in the walls instead of windows. Wooden doors were also rather expensive. Thus, the doorway was frequently covered with a curtain. Kruk houses were not only for humans. Medieval peasants also brought their animals inside every night. There were several reasons why they did this. At the time, wild creatures such as wolves and bears roamed freely in England. Therefore, animals were brought in for their own protection. Animals left outside at night were not only at risk of being murdered, but also of being stolen or simply wandering away. For these reasons, the animals were kept indoors at night. The downside to bringing the animals inside was that they tended to make the peasants' houses even dirtier than they already were. Peasant Kruk dwellings lacked basic amenities such as toilets and running water. Medieval peasants' homes would not have had running water, toilets, bathtubs, or sinks. Soap did not exist in medieval times, so you can only image the scent. Yeah, I know, gross. All of these conditions contributed to medieval peasants being infested with fleas, lice, and filth. Instead of a proper toilet, medieval peasants would have used a bucket that was periodically emptied into the nearest river at the start of the day. Hygiene. Based on what we've learned so far, it's obvious that the hygiene was not a key priority for medieval peasants. A hot, soapy bubble bath is unlikely to have been a regular part of a medieval peasant's day. However, it was not only peasants who lacked personal hygiene, the rich as well. An affluent individual, for example, might have had a bath only a few times each year. There was no knowledge at all about personal hygiene at the time, so people would not have connected poor hygiene and sanitation with diseases. Even when they were able to receive a bath, the water was not guaranteed to be clean. The water they were bathing in could have been as dirty as lavatory waste, which was often dumped into rivers. Peasants' wives and children. In medieval times, infant mortality rates were extremely high, meaning that around half of all the children born would die within the first year of their lives. Children were also not sent to school like they are today. Education was reserved for the rich sections of society. Alternatively, children may be educated in monasteries and eventually become monks. Instead of attending school, medieval peasant children would have received their education on the family farm, learning how to raise food and care for cattle. They may have also worked as apprentices for local craftspeople, learning how to be a blacksmith, tailor, and so on. This was solely for guys. Ladies' schooling was very different. Young girls learned domestic skills from their mums, such as spinning wool on wooden wheels to make blankets and clothing. Having children was extremely dangerous in medieval times, as it is estimated that approximately 20% of women perished during childbirth. In terms of career, women were expected to stay at home and care for their family. There were certain exceptions for women who resided in larger communities. These women could work in local stores or taverns, or make a living by selling garments. Some women may have also worked as servants in higher income houses. Well, there you have it, the day in the life of a medieval peasant. If you like this video and want to see more Middle Ages videos like these, subscribe to my channel, Medieval Mind, and watch my other videos as well. Goodbye.